Okay, we're ready, I think, if everyone's here. So this is the final session of the day, and it's going to be about media in the Gulf. Thank you all for staying and listening to this session. We'll be talking about the current state of the media, both legacy media and new media in the Gulf, and what are the hopes for freedom of expression, and how can those hopes be realized. My name is Rodri Davis. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a kind of rather nuanced experience of media in the Gulf, having worked for Al Jazeera English for 6 years on digital and in broadcast. So, you know, Al Jazeera English is a state broadcaster, but not a public service broadcaster. And we'll be talking about the range of kind of media throughout the region. But obviously, as we know, the story of media in the Gulf is one of overwhelming state dominance. And we've seen the proliferation of new media in the Gulf before and post-Arab Spring. But those mediums have again been co-opted by governments, so we've seen changes there as well, but we'll talk more about that with our speakers. We've got Haifa Halfallah, is that right? And she's an academic, but more relevant to this session, she's a former journalist who's worked in Kuwait with Al Watan newspaper, which is now defunct, I think, but it was no, is it not? Is it, no, is it? But it's but it's an independent newspaper, yeah. And you worked with Al Kabas, a daily Arabic newspaper, and as well you've been involved with Index on Censorship and Article 19, so freedom of expression organizations. And we have also Bill Law, who's reported extensively from the Middle East and North Africa for the BBC until about 2014. You were the BBC's Gulf analyst, correct? And you now are an analyst, and you've just been named editor of the Arab Digest, which is an analyst service provider. So first of all, just to get us started, we are going to have two videos. One from Sheikha Al-Jassim from the University of Kuwait, and another from Adel Marcuz, who's the editor-in-chief of Gulf House for Studies and Publishing, and the president of the Bahrain Press Association. Mohammed. Are we gonna? Are they all right, Mohammed? Okay. Should we come back to them? Yeah. Well, we can just. We'll just start with an opening little chat about what makes media environment that's conducive to freedom of expression and a good free press. I think from my experience working in a newsroom, at a place like Al Jazeera and elsewhere. I now work at the BBC and Associated Press. You've got to have that open flow of communication. And you've got to be able to say whatever you want in a newsroom. As soon as that starts to become limited, then you're not going to have a product, which is also about freedom of expression and able to poke at any area of the world and any issue properly. Haifa, for yourself, what do you think are the conditions and the structures necessary to have a good free press and media? Yeah, okay, and Bill?
I think it's important to have freedom. I think it's also important to have responsibility, that freedom doesn't come without responsibility. And I think part of that responsibility is that open flow of communication and that ability to listen, sometimes to views you don't like to hear. But I think that's very important.
Yeah, for sure. I think at Al Jazeera English, it was the kind of saving grace of Al Jazeera English, and it got a lot of prominence worldwide, but the saving grace was that Qatar wasn't the issue of the day the vast majority of the time. So those issues weren't quite such a problem in the newsroom. Yeah, and I think that, okay, there were still other issues there, and there were still other ways that coverage was skewed one way or another, but that's how Al Jazeera English is kind of able to gain prominence and gain a good image. Can we do the videos now, Mohammed? We'll go. Okay, we'll come back to them. Okay, so now Haifa, in your experience, I mean, you've got obviously good experience of Kuwait, but then much more broadly in the Gulf as well. I mean, what's the kind of current state of play, do you think, in the media landscape? Both kind of, well, let's talk about traditional legacy media.
Thank you very much. I also worked as the Middle East editor of the Flat Energy Service, which is the Bible for energy industry. So I saw it from both sides, and I see my contribution to this panel, which I was drafted very late, is to provide a longer and geographically wider lens to dangers facing the media in the Gulf and other Arab-speaking countries. These are threats to the world, not only to the Gulf. To begin with,
الباب نحو التغيير. دول الخليج تعتمد بشكل أساسي على أسرها.
Do you want to carry on, Haifa, and we'll come to the videos once the... yeah, I think... Mohammed, what do you want to do, Mohammed? Continue, okay.
I begin with something you mentioned. I would like to remind us all, especially those of us who are not as ancient as I am, that at a certain time in the 1980s, the Center of Arabic Language, Free Press, Dynamic Thought, and New Democracy in Islamic Experiment was Kuwait, that is the Gulf. It has ceased to be Egypt or Lebanon or indeed the Western Mediterranean and North African shores. I know because I had the fortune to work as a journalist in Kuwait at that time. I wasn't planning, it was just the sheer...
Yeah, you can just...
I fell into journalism by the sheer energy and the daring vision of so many Kuwaitis and other citizens as well as Arabic-speaking countries, that Kuwait attracted them at the time, just as a flower attracts butterflies. Really. I started at Al-Watan, that became moved to Al-Qabas as the first Arab woman to have an economic section of the business group paper, Al-Qabas. It comes all, when you started, and I think Bill mentioned it, it comes all to credibility. Because freedom has the other side of the equation of freedom's credibility and holding power to account. The word press, the rest of the world believed our stories and indeed quoted us. And as a result, in Al-Watan, in this small, tiny state, and this is the power of freedom and the weight of free press, in a small, tiny state, I remember we had the absolute who's who of the Arabic-speaking intelligentsia come to us, ambassadors of the world powers of the United States, of all Arab ambassadors, and people from the World Bank, etc. The interesting part about this flowering of free press, and again I'd like us to remember, all of us always remember this, that as the press in Kuwait constantly pushed for more freedom, for more professionalism, newspapers, because the rest of the media is state-owned, of course, with TV and radio. The cause of free press and the publications themselves became fashionable. It became prestigious. And this is how I actually moved to Al-Qabas, who decided they would bolster its image with the most daring and the best. So my story is the story of three of us. It's not of me alone. Of three journalists, of three people who worked in the free press and were victims of censorship. But these were the lucky victims, the ones that were, because the other two are far more famous than me, because the world knows about them. And outwardly we look okay. Of course we're not okay. I had been a successful journalist covering OPEC. They brought Najil Ali, the impressible, well-known cartoonist, who was at the time, if I remember, was living in Lebanon, and most of all, their own, and until that time, unappreciated poet, Ahmed Matar, became, all of a sudden, as he should have been, one of their stars, and they started boasting about him. It was an intelligent move to be saluted, regardless of the intentions of the owners. But, and this is the question, is this is the problem that faces us all. It's not a problem of free media, it's a problem of tyranny. Because tyranny, we can speak about the free media from here until the day of judgment. It doesn't make any difference. As long as there are tyranny, none of us are safe. And that's the problem, because good governance is not a privilege. It is an oxygen. So the goons of dictators in the region, in my case, the dictator next door, his name was Saddam Hussein, and his goons sifted my papers. I can tell you from here till tomorrow, it's only when they threatened my parents in Cairo that I will move physically with it. Economic journalism, in some ways, is heartless. It's apolitical. Then I decided to move to London and index web. But the governments, the other dictators of the Gulf pushed the Kuwaiti government to kick out from Kuwait, from the whole Gulf, Najir Ali, the cartoonist, somebody who doodled, and Ahmed Matar, he's a poet. So they, luckily for me, Al-Qabas had an office in London, so they came to London, and here we were again, 3 of us. The amazing thing is that when you censor somebody, you make them tough, you make them tougher. And indeed, with Index, and I have to say this, and I stress it 100 times, thanks to the intelligentsia, what's the British intelligentsia, of every soul, journalists, rabbi, whoever you can mention, 3 of us prospered. And thanks to our colleagues in the region, we continue to publish, and this time not only in Arabic, but in English, across the world, from America, because I had joined also McGraw-Hill as the Middle East editor of Clans. So here, our agency not only wasn't intact, we increased, and we thought we were doing fine, and we thought that we won the day. This is why I said tyranny is a problem, because it's never. We can think we succeeded for a day, but it doesn't happen that way. Najir Ali was murdered in South Kensington Street. Ahmed Matar drank into himself, and I had the pleasure of having thallium poison administered to me and ruined my life for a few years. So, and we were reminded that with the murder of Marhum Jamal Khashoggi, that it reaches everywhere, from the streets of London to Istanbul, to everywhere. And here I was, a journalist for a top American publishing house, the Bible of the oil industry, and it reached me. And it actually reached Western journalists. And therefore, none of us is ever safe. I'll end up, I'm sorry for being long, but this is long-winded, but I just want to remind everybody that it was Najir Ali, the dead Najir Ali, Ahmed Matar, even Marhum Jamal Khashoggi, are the lucky ones to survive. And we continue to survive. They, the 3 of them, they live far longer than their oppressors. But it's the hundreds of thousands, our colleagues, everywhere, across the years, that none of us, including you and other journalists, we don't know about, is that what should be our concern, something that should make us let's do better.
Thanks. I mean, so Bill is talking about kind of how people work on the ground, media people work on the ground, and how people work outside of Gulf countries. I mean, that's very much where we are, do you think, in your experience?
Well, first of all, I just want to pay credit to you, Haifa, and to your colleagues. And it is an extraordinarily difficult journey that particularly Arab journalists have taken, and the courage that they have shown. And we've reached a kind of, I think, terrible place now, which is very concerning, because I feel like outside of the Gulf, I mean, we're seeing the attacks on media across the world. Journalists are being imprisoned, journalists are being attacked, the credibility of journalism is under assault by the President of the United States on a daily basis. So we are in a very difficult place. I mean, myself, as a journalist, I remember the first time that I figured out a way to get into Saudi Arabia, because after that story, the film of the princess, there was a fatwa against any BBC journalist. I was able to get in finally, I think it was in 2002, which is the first time that I met Jamal Khashoggi. And the excitement I felt, that here I was, in a place that was kind of a mysterious kingdom, a desert kingdom. And I was able to do stories, and amongst the best stories I did were actually interviewing women, because women were more prepared to speak out, because they felt so frustrated. At that time, women, could only go into two professions, health or teaching. And women who wanted to be journalists were severely frustrated in that situation. Subsequently, and I went back to Saudi many times, I did a lot of work in Bahrain. The issue that you face as a Western journalist is mild. I mean, I was detained a couple of times in Bahrain. There were a couple of moments in Saudi Arabia where I felt a little insecure, if you will. But the people that I interviewed, the people who were there, the people in place who had the courage to speak, they're the ones that pay the price. And I still feel it, every day I think about people that I have interviewed. I have friends who are in prison, good friends who are in prison. And I think the challenge, and dead, sadly, and dead. And I think the challenge is that we must not, and I think Matthew Hedges used the phrase, we must not normalize this behavior. We mustn't accept this appalling situation. We have to find ways to challenge it. But equally, I feel the need to be careful that we don't put too much pressure and expectation on people who are in those countries. Because now, particularly with Mohammed bin Salman, it's clear that it's not good enough simply not to criticize, that your silence is seen as an implicit criticism. Therefore, you must, if you want to remain a journalist, be a propagandist. You must flog the propaganda. You must flog the lies, which must be the cruelest thing for a journalist to face. So I think that there are huge, huge challenges. And I do also want to speak about Al-Wasat in Bahrain, which was shuttered in 2017. It was an independent voice, so precious, so unique, really, in the Gulf. I mean, I remember the first time I was in Kuwait. It was just ahead of the war in 2003, and I was struck by even then, the vibrancy of the media compared to what I'd experienced in Saudi Arabia in particular. But, we take so much for granted here. We've got to remember, I think, that the people in place are facing it, and now I think it's even more difficult and more challenging. And with Al-Wasat, closed in 2017, not a word mentioned. I mean, there was virtually silence when this and a hugely brave and generous editor, Mansour Jamri, who struggled to keep that publication going. In 2011, it was shut down. The goons were sent in to wreck the printing presses. Their reporters were seized. Their photojournalists were seized. They were beaten up. And most awfully, the co-founder, Karim Al-Fakawi, was beaten to death in a jail cell. And it was only because this came to light that the couple of people who had been told to beat him were sentenced to 7 years, and they got knocked down to 3 years. So I wanted to mention these very, very brave people that we here in the West sometimes put the question, why aren't they speaking up more? Well, they can't. That's the reality.
And there are other examples as well. Raif Badawi in Saudi, a blogger. Muatin here from Oman set up online websites talking against the government, and Mohammed is now in exile, and numerous others. So if we don't want to put too much pressure on people in these countries, where is the space for debate? Where is the space for some kind of dialogue on the issues? Is it always outside of the country? Even then, is that still a problem? Haifa?
If you allow me to disagree a bit pressure is something that we didn't choose. It was put on us. So don't worry about us as what we do. In fact, keep egging us to do more. Please do. What it is important is people like Bill, like you, like the media, and from my experience in indexing censorship and as a consultant in a couple of projects for Amnesty International, really, Western media and Western intelligentsia, the good part of it is very, very good, and it can be, it's a partnership, it's a human partnership, if there is ever a human partnership, it's this. So perhaps the way forward is to try to push it furthermore in the priorities of key Western media. This is my thing.
Bill, do you agree with that? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's, yes, I do agree. I think that's, it's very important to keep the pressure up, particularly now, and in the previous session, mention was made of the FCO and the fact the FCO has done so little to address the issues of human rights. I mean, the situation we've got now is that this is a country that's just bedeviled and perplexed and obsessed with Brexit. But that's an easy out, isn't it? Because the various government departments say, we can't deal with anything else. We've got to figure out Brexit. And that's, it's just not good enough, is it? Because you don't park human rights. You don't park the lives of people at risk. You don't park the fact that many, it's not just the journalists, their families. I mean, the families have paid, and the human rights activists, their families have paid an enormous price. It's gone on for years and years. And of course, the situation in America, once Trump came in, any pretense towards human rights was just dropped without any consideration. So there we are. We are faced with this huge difficulty. I think we do have to keep finding ways, creative ways, to keep the story in front of people. And Hatice Cengiz, who I believe is here, has done an enormous, the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi, has done an enormously courageous efforts all across the world, speaking about the terrible, atrocious murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And yes, Davos in the desert this year, all of these entrepreneurs came back and spent their time listening to pitches from Mohammed bin Salman's henchmen. You know what? There are people who didn't go. So, we should be looking at the ones who didn't go still. There are people who did withdraw funding. And Mohammed bin Salman is in a difficult place because if he doesn't deliver Vision 2030, which I think is a good shot, he won't deliver it, then, people are going to begin to ask other questions. In the meantime, it's important to remind people that what he's trying to do is to silence completely any form of criticism, including criticism of Vision 2030. And this whole Saudi Aramco IPO, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on, perhaps over a coffee, is showing just how vulnerable he is. So I think we do not and must not lose hope. And we must salute people like Hatice Cengiz, who have done an enormous job in keeping the story of the fight for a free and open media. And freedom, really, the right to speak, just the right to speak. I mean, I have a friend, this is going back 2 years, she said, Bill, the walls are closing in. We can't breathe. We can't breathe. And I wrote an article about that, and I titled it, I Can't Breathe. There was an African-American who was suffocated by the police, and his last words were, I can't breathe. We have to find the space. We have an obligation to find the space so that we allow people to find the right to breathe. I think that's very important, and I think journalism plays a huge role in doing that.
Great. We'll pick back up off that, we're just going to go to the videos, which are apparently ready. So first of all, we've got Sheikha as Jami, Al Jasim, pardon?
الحريات وهي الباب نحو التغيير. دول الخليج تعتمد بشكل اساسي على اسر حاكمه، والاسر الحاكمه بطبيعه الحال تريد ان توطن من سيطرتها وتؤكد سيطرتها، ولذلك هي تستخدم اي الطرق الممكنه سواء المال السياسي سواء يعني السياسات الداخليه او الخارجيه فقط لتوثيق سلطتها وبقائها في السلطه. إضافة إلى الوفرة المادية عند الشعوب، فهذا يجعل الناس مرتاحين ولا يعبأون بالتغيير. إضافة إلى أن بعضهم يعاني من الأمنية السياسية، لا يعلم ما هي حقوقه. لذلك أنا أرى بأن الحرية، حرية التعبير هي أساس التغيير في كل دول الخليج، لأن لو كانت هذه الحرية موجودة، وهي في بعضها موجودة طبعا، هناك فرق ما بين الدول، هناك دول تعتبر حرية التعبير فيها معدومة نهائيا، وهناك دول أفضل من غيرها، ولكن حرية التعبير هي المدخل أولا لزيادة وعي الشعوب نحو التغيير السياسي والاجتماعي والاقتصادي، وأن ذلك في مصلحتهم، أيضا للمخاطبة مع السلطة وللتخاطب والحوار ويعني حتى نعرف إلى أين نحن ذاهبين. أنا أعتقد هذه حرية التعبير نقطة أساسية تجعلنا جميعا كشعوب وكأسر حاكمة نذهب إلى ديمقراطية وإلى مستقبل أفضل.
Great, and we have a second video, which is from Adel Marcuz.
تحية طيبة إلى جميع الحضور في هذا المؤتمر. أنا هو الخاسر الأكبر لأني لن أستمع إلى مداخلاتكم، فقط تستمعون أنتم إلى هذه المداخلة. خاسر أكبر لأني لن أستمع إلى مداخلة أيضا الصديقين صفاء الأحمد والصديق بلو. تحدي الوجود والمزاحمة. الدولة تستخدم نشاطا أسميه بالبابليسيتي، النشر، تقوم باستخدام هذا النشاط في مجال الجورناليزم أو الصحافة. ما يبث في دول الخليج من وسائل الإعلام هو ليس صحافة، ولا إن كان يتمظهر في شكل صحف أو عمل صحفي، هو في النهاية عملية نشر لهذه الحكومات والدول. القدرة على الوجود داخل هذه التنظيمات القانونية التي تضعها دول الخليج هو أول التحديات. مزاحمة هذا القطاع الضخم والشبكات الضخمة التي تمثل قطاع النشر للدولة، هذا أيضا تحدي كبير. التحدي الثاني هو تحدي البقاء. هنا لا أتحدث عن الصحافة في الخليج فقط، هو تحدي للصحافة كلها في كل مكان. كيف تستمر هذه المؤسسات الصحفية مستقلة مادية، قادرة على أن تكون مؤسسات مجتمع مدني حقيقية دون تمويل سياسي من الدولة أو حتى من المعارضات. هذه إشكالية كبيرة لا تخص منطقة الخليج فحسب. اليوم لدينا الصحف في أوروبا، في بريطانيا، في فرنسا، في الولايات المتحدة نشتكي وتشتكي كثير من الأوساط بأنها تنزع سياسيا وأنها تستجيب للمال السياسي. التحدي الثالث هو تحدي القدرة والإبداع. القدرة على الخلق والإبداع بمعنى استطاعة الصحفيين والمؤسسات الصحفية على تنويع أدواتها ومنصاتها التي تستخدمها في القيام بمهامها. نحن نطور الأدوات، دخلنا في عالم التواصل الاجتماعي، لكن الدول الخليج لم تكن عاجزة أيضا عن تطوير آلياتها في الملاحقة والمراقبة للصحفيين أو حتى للنشطاء في المجتمع المدني. التحدي الرابع تحدي الحماية والتأمين. العمل فرادى لن يفيد، التأخر في حماية الصحفيين وفي تأمين سلامتهم لا يفيد. لقد دفعت منطقة الخليج ضحايا، قدمت ضحايا أهمهم أو آخرهم هو جمال خاشقجي. أعتقد أن على المؤسسات الصحفية والنقابات ومؤسسات المجتمع المدني التي تهتم بملف الصحافة والإعلام في الخليج أن تكون واعية إلى أهمية تطوير آلية تدخل سريع لحماية الصحفيين والنشطاء في منطقة الخليج. دمتم بخير.
Great. We can just pick up on something that Adele was saying there, that the way social media has developed in the region, we see countries like Saudi Arabia, the fourth biggest user of Twitter in the world. But as that space has opened, it's also been crushed, and those tools have been used by states to crack down upon and oppress people who want freedom of expression. Bill, is that something that's kind of generic across the countries in the Gulf, or are there differences there?
Yeah, I remember when the internet first came on stream, you know, that seems like a long time ago because we always lived with it. It's not that long ago, but the line then was you cannot regulate the internet. It's just impossible. And effectively that's the situation in Western democracies. The internet is an open space. Anybody can say anything that they basically want to. Some of it is very, very good. Some of it's awful. And then, you know, along comes Donald Trump to completely redefine the landscape and the geography once more in his use of tweets. But the idea that, you know, the social online can't not be regulated. In fact, what we're seeing in the Gulf is, yeah, oh, yes, it can. You can buy, because you've got the resources, you can buy the best malware, the best surveillance. You can pass laws, cybersecurity laws, call them anti-terrorism laws, to crush any free speech. And we saw that with Nabil Rajab, who criticized the war in Yemen, 5 years for that, for a tweet. So the point is that, yeah, the internet is severely, savagely regulated in the Gulf states.
And not just, though, through laws. I mean, through harassment, trolling by government employees that really cuts people off from, can drown people out, and also put people in such a difficult position that they don't want to speak, so they censor themselves. I mean, is that something which is the same in kind of Kuwait, do you think? Do you know?
The region, but rather than pick on this country or that country, because it's come even into the West with some of the new laws against radicalism, and Twitter itself is doing, especially Twitter and MENA. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people know what they've been doing. They're doing their own censorship. So rather than saying this or that country, perhaps we as journalists, the media in general, should start, or as much as we don't like some of the persons that cut journalists into pieces and put them wherever it is, maybe we should change the discourse a bit, I don't know, and focus on a corrupt political culture, wherever it is. It's a very dangerous political culture that we cannot accept as humans with shared values, rather than this country or that country, because I think media companies are now getting into the act of censorship.
Can we talk about one thing coming before the other? Political change, social change, media change? Or not really? Okay, and I mean, so where then do we kind of go from here? What kind of hope is there for that progress then that you're talking about?
Seriously, your question is very, very important, because when you create a cage that you keep people in, not only do you dehumanize them, you make them less intelligent and less able to come up with solutions. Our friend here, Ustad Anwar, in the discussions. Why can't we have solution? Why can't we? We can because we're not used to discussing political thought. The minute you talk political, and this is a long tradition. I'm a historian, and it goes back in history. If you stop them discussing a subject, they will be unintelligent, simplistic when it comes to this subject, and they won't be able to find a way out. So, and it makes them also dangerous to the rest of the world.
Yeah, Bill, do you want to add anything?
Well, I did want to add something in terms of with the approach that this political field is doing is try as much as we try as any autocrat might try to squeeze it out of the that water. It's real hungry. It's right that people open the mind.
Is that better? Yeah, okay. That people do get desensitized and they stop asking questions. But, you know, that's the role of journalism, is to ask questions and speak to the part. Can I just do something? I wanted to, you mentioned poetry, and poetry is so much a part of Gulf and Arab culture. This is coming back to Al-Wasat. This is a poem by a young Bahraini. And I asked him if I might read it today, because I told him I was going to be talking about media. And his name is Ali Al-Jamli. He's the son of Mansur Al-Jamli. He was the last editor and publisher of Al-Wasat. Al-Wasat is the site, the media site, and the newspaper closed down in 2017, but in 2019 the building was demolished. Ali has written, it's called After the Last Edition. The ink stains on the rollers, like so much coughed up blood, are dry to the touch. Halls echo desertion, and dust mates with dust. None knock but the bulldozer. None knock but the man in the hookah. The stories, the photos, the rusted presses, they cannot speak. The bulldozer rumbles a Bedouin language, deep, guttural, prehistoric, one extended moan. It even as snapping metal shrieks beneath collapsing walls. A loose sheet flutters free. It carries an ink-stained olive branch.
So, fairly bleak on the whole, though, really, you'd say that. And
But the last two lines, Rodri, are about hope and about that unquenchable thirst. That's the important thing I would like us to take away.
and we've had the situation with Jamal's murder, and you know where these governments, well, Saudi is going far outside of its own country to stop people from speaking out. So where are those voices coming from now? We've had that situation, which is, you know, you would think would push back a lot of the kind of movement for freedom of expression. What do you think? Do you think it has, or do you think there are voices there?
I think the voices are there. I think it's an existential struggle. It's not just about the Gulf. It's, as Tim said, this is a worldwide struggle we're engaged in. And journalists, yes, are on the front line. And journalists have paid, not in the West, at least not yet, but in places and regions, in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in China, they pay terrible, terrible prices. But we need to acknowledge that we are in a war, and in war you have to figure out strategies. So it's a good question that we need to start to devise some strategies and some fight back. But the first strategy is do not abandon hope. That's what I believe is the starting point. And also I think that there's so much strength and intelligence and energy and determination among young Arabs. That's the power, that's the source. No bogey like me, who cares? But it's that young, and they're not going to accept. They've already said we don't accept the social contract that our parents agreed to, which is we give you everything you want, but don't ask any difficult questions. Right now, the reason why there's so much repression is because these ruling families know those difficult questions are surfacing, and they're trying to find a way to shut them down. And at some point, the mechanisms they're using, and history shows this, they will fail. So we've got to be there to record that story, I think.
And Haifa, I mean, are you able to point to anything kind of structurally that's able to change, presumably outside of the Gulf countries, that can help those voices come to the surface and, you know, help them proliferate?
If we would go back to the role of the world media again, because journalism is this, of course I'd say that my father was a journalist, I was a journalist, but these brilliant, real journalists, not court jesters, and they're a bit of a Colombo, they're a bit of this, they're a bit of that, they are multi-talented. So one of the things we really need to do, well, I can't include myself because I'm not a journalist anymore, but to be able to differentiate between voices of opposition that are calling for reforms and voices of oppositions that are just noises, or what I call them the past dancers. I just want to return to some, hypothetical past or whatever, and there are different pasts, or some people who think themselves, they use these fancy progressive, radical, which is really meaningless. So it's really up, because journalists write the first draft of history, the most brilliant draft of history. And in so doing, they sort out a lot of the fluff in events. And in the West, we need, because now the Western media, whether you like it or not, is at the forefront of journalists still fighting despite what's going on in the United States or anywhere else. That we need to be nuanced and to ask more questions and not to believe, and so are human rights organizations, because I think human rights organizations, they have a problem now. International Human Rights Organization is this almost simplistic view of the word, human rights versus the bad guy. It doesn't happen that way. Some people who call for change call for negative change, if you listen very carefully to what they say. And some people are brilliant, and some of those brilliant people, brilliant intellectuals, are right now in jails, in Saudi jails. I can't see Yahya al-Asiri. Yahya al-Asiri has a good friend. That guy, I never knew. Okay, there you are. I'm talking about Abdullah al-Maliki. I didn't know him. I followed him in Twitter. And my mind was blown with the energy. Why is this energy in jail? The price of the Arabian Peninsula is paying now and in the future for this specific guy, just one guy in jail, is huge for him.
And in terms of, we've spoken a little bit about Western media outlets being a source or a place where these voices can be heard or where you can talk against the governments. What about, I mean, Bill, you're an editor of a subscription service analytical publication. I mean, do you think that there are different modes of being able to finance outlets whereby these voices can be heard? I mean, you're seeing things in the West now where they're trying to do different subscription service, let's say something like The Correspondent in the Netherlands, where people pay for a subscription and you get a very kind of different type of content. It's not following the news, it's talking about issues that readers suggest they want to hear. I mean, do you think that there's a model that makes something viable financially and sustainably?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to figure out different financial models. But one of the things, Arab Digest almost passed away last week, and I wanted to keep it going because it is an independent site. It is not tied to, and we know just how much money the Gulf ruling families have splashed out in all kinds of areas and the kind of influence they've had. Most of it negative, most of it. Of course, Al Jazeera, particularly Al Jazeera English, has done some very, benchmark work, set the standard for the quality of journalism that we should aim for. And Al Jazeera Arabic, we could have a conversation about, certainly in view of things like, yes, we could do. But I think, it's important that particularly in the West, as we say, that people can go to a site and they know that the journalism is independent and it's quality journalism, it's objective. And I think Eva's made a very important point, is that we need as journalists to examine everybody's motives. And simply banging away about human rights can have negative consequences, particularly for the people who are in situ and are affected by those, by the campaigns. I think that's another discussion perhaps. But yeah, I think we're on the cusp of either losing the battle or trying to figure out a way where independent journalism can be financed by people paying small amounts of money. And, the compromises that big media make can be quite devastating. I mean, I would point to my previous organization, the BBC, and the role that it has played in the Brexit campaign, for example, or the extent to which the BBC fell under the influence of the Israeli lobby. So in some ways, there are huge opportunities still online for the kind of journalism that I'm trying to promote on Arab Digest, that various other sources are trying to do, and I think that's probably the way forward. So small is beautiful, and big has lots of problems tied to it.
Corporate, if I may add to it, I think this really sums it up. If we, as journalists, make credibility and seriousness attractive and pays and prestigious, we can attract funds. And this is why I started with the experience in Kuwait. It was attractive, even the two most dubious characters. And this is a challenge. The problem with corporate media, it becomes a corporate, but the bottom line is credible, serious, attractive.
Great. I was going to try and finish on an optimistic note, and you've already done it, so great. And we can open it up to the floor, actually. Haven't got loads of time, but we've got some time for a few questions, if anyone's got any.
So, is this on, or? Yeah. To what extent do you think we can fairly assess that sort of liberal democracies have come to a formidable way in developing rights-based cybersecurity laws? And if that is a negative assessment, do you think that lack of progress in that area is undermining sort of the role of activists and policymakers to seriously benchmark cybersecurity laws start being developed in more authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a tough question, because I do think that liberal democracy is under assault, and one of the ways it's under assault is because there is a lack of regulation on social media. But as Heba said, is once you bring in regulation, it becomes another issue, and who brings it in? If a government brings in those regulations, that raises issues. If it's the company that brings it in, you mentioned Twitter started, Facebook started. Yeah, but how far can you trust them? And yet at the same time, I think we do have to find some way to protect the values of liberal democracy, one of which is freedom of expression. It's a conundrum. I would hope that more pressure is brought to bear on these big corporations, on Twitter, on Facebook, to show more responsibility in terms of what they themselves are allowing up. I mean, when I was at the BBC as a producer, there was a guidebook, and there were things that you didn't put in. And if you did put them in, you had to have them, double sourced, copper bottom, we used to say. All of these things have been simply swept aside. Maybe we need to look at the old way and find a way to work that into the new challenge that we're facing.
I think there is a problem though, that if even, for instance, take China and the difference between how social media plays out in the West and in China, what content's allowed on those platforms, that even if we have regulations in America or in England, that might not apply in Saudi, for instance. Yeah, it's quite difficult, right? Any other questions?
Well, no, regarding what we are now seeing across the Gulf countries is the idea of regulating social media, or what they call content of social media, not banning social media, but what goes into that, and really, and the material that people write or say can be used against them in the public prosecution. So like somebody retweets a story, that means he or she agrees with the material that was retweeted, with the total content, or puts a like on an Instagram account. So really, I see really more dangers ahead rather than more smiles ahead in the Gulf, really, with this idea of regulating, bringing some models, like from Singapore, the model of spreading fake news, and from other countries in the Gulf, and from China. So people, and the authorities are using this argument that we have to regulate that. This is the age of technology, money laundering, infringement of privacy, really, and this is a space that has not been regulated, and that's very serious. Really, I think really there is need for attention, because what we're going to see is people leaving, more people leaving and or going underground. So I can see really more dangers ahead if left alone.
Yeah, I think it's an area which is in such flux. It's very difficult because actually you see some countries taking total control of their internet services. So you want to keep an openness, but again, you need some form of regulation. It's very difficult, right? And someone at the back.
I would like to talk about the audience and the access to information they have. The Gulf have been censoring websites for decades, and that's one of the regions that use the most censorship, and many news websites in particular, are censored. I'm wondering, how social media has disrupted that, and how much people, and young people in particular, are accessing information on their countries online via maybe dissident people reporting the news or human rights violations under the radar in secret. So do you see any rising citizen initiative, dissident voices using social media to report on local news? And how much young people have access to non-official information online?
Well, I think that the Gulf, the penetration, I think the point was made that Twitter is hugely popular in Saudi Arabia. And I think when it first hit, there was this kind of, and you can understand it, massive excitement, because you get these chat rooms where young men and young women could have conversations which they can't have, or couldn't have. This is before the reforms of Mohammed bin Salman. Couldn't have, in a cafe. So that was very exciting and very ennobling. And I think there was the sense then that we can engage, we can have conversations, because to go back to young people very much want to be part of a new narrative in the Gulf, but they're being denied that. When they engaged in that, and when they pushed a little far, Raif Badawi is a perfect example of that. They were jailed. The ruling families are afraid. They are afraid of that energy. But as I said earlier, you can't tamp it down. You can do, and people are paying terrible prices right now for it. But eventually, that energy will override the autocrats. In terms of what's available, yeah, there are exchanges, but people in places like Saudi Arabia have to be very careful, because the surveillance technology is, extraordinary. And so, and Jassim has made the point that they keep ramping it up. So if, for example, you are discovered to be following, not even retweeting, but following the views of someone who's critical of Mohammed bin Salman, you're in trouble. So there's been actually a clampdown. So there's less available. And meanwhile, in Saudi, the deal is we will give you entertainment. Young men and young women can go to music concerts. You can see Maria Carey and you can do all these exciting things, and we'll build you an entertainment city. We're doing all these but don't ever think that means that you can actually say anything critical, or you can use your critical faculties. Well, as Haifa said, you're disempowering the future, and it won't work. But to answer your question, I think that the availability of news sources is shrinking, of objective sources. But I don't think the battle's lost. No, I don't.
I may add to this. We seem to forget something. I know it's in the box, and therefore we don't pay attention to a very serious fact that the dictators realize far better than us, is that a place like Twitter, social media like Twitter, has become the effective parliament of a country, of the region, that anybody can be a member of and can exchange views openly. And that's very, very dangerous. And therefore it changed, and we wanted to get that in the first session, into a discussion about that. Unfortunately, we didn't have time, about the definition of the political. In the Arab world, are you from the Arab world? Are you Arabic speaker? In many places, the word political itself is totally misunderstood to mean that sacred space of the sultan, of the absolute ruler, or something bad, something that bad people do, the political. And therefore, for example, and I'll give you the hilarious, sad example in Egypt, when somebody who is pro-Sisi women wanted to defend him, she said, he's a good man, he's not like those horrible activists. He doesn't do politics. He doesn't know politics, he's not political. You wonder, okay, what's he doing there? And political is the negotiation. Twitter and Facebook, to a lesser degree, made us as Arabic speakers, and I speak about the Arabic speakers, have a collective conversation that brings our communal memories, the good communal memories, but also to make us remember that the political is about the negotiation of powers in a community, who has the power of one. And this is very exciting. Many of us didn't realize it, even though we practice it every day. The dictators did. I told you, they're always 10 steps ahead of us, unfortunately.
They need to be, yeah. And there's a really interesting nuance and difference to how Twitter kind of plays out in the West as well, in terms of, we it's been seen a lot more in terms of lambasting each other and less about the functionality of politics. Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions. Has anyone got any more? No? We're all done? All right, that's it. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. If you want to go by all means. But we're going to go straight to a wrap-up session, just to have Sahar, Josh, and Jawad just kind of hear a kind of recap of things that we discussed in now. Now, if you can bear with it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sticking around and your stamina. We were initially thinking to have a break, but I think given the time constraints, we thought just power on, and then we can hopefully have time at the end for more talking and hopefully finish up the food. We've got a lot of that left over. But thank you all so much for staying. I'll introduce myself very quickly. I'm Josh Cooper. I work with Jawad at Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, and with Yahya at Al-Qis. So there's no way I was missing this event. And so this session is slightly different. The title is Summary, Wrap-Up and Recommendations. So it's intended just to kind of follow up with anything that we think has been missed throughout the conference, some burning questions and points that you wish to raise, particularly as it's been quite constrained for time. And also, given the title of the conference is An Inspired Future, this particular session is really there to have a forward-looking agenda in terms of follow-up actions we can do ourselves to realise this vision of an inspired future for the Gulf. So without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. So we'll hear from Jawad, who's the chairman of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, who will give some remarks and some recommendations, and we'll hear from Safa Al-Faifi, who is a volunteer at Al-Qis and plays a crucial role with Al-Qis in a voluntary capacity, as well as her extensive activity as a community activist and a network organiser in Cardiff and in Wales. And she's been very busy in recent weeks as a result of the election. So it's great for her to join from Wales. And she'll be giving a summary of the events of today with the help of Mamina, who's been writing up notes over the course of the day. So without further ado, I'll pass on who would like to go first. Okay, so
thank you so much, Josh. He's a colleague of mine now from Al-Qist. So I'm Sahar Al-Faifi, a civil rights activist, but also I'm an anti-Islamophobia campaigner. So I do my volunteering for Al-Qist whenever I have time. This conference, the aims of this conference is actually to get different perspective on the political situation, as well as human rights, as well as the media. In this conference, I hope that it's unique. It's the first of its kind because it gathered all the GCC activists in human rights together under one roof. A lot of them discussed the different tensions that each of the GCC's Gulf country experienced, because this is one of the things that we got from this conference, is that we must not paint all the GCC countries with the same brush. The experience of the civil rights or human rights activism in Bahrain is different from Saudi, and so on. Also, it was covered the different type of tensions, the internal and the external tensions, and the role of the Western countries in intensifying these tensions, and what can we do as a grassroots activists and human rights defenders. Our conversation must not be an elitist conversation. It is our duty to disseminate this information in a simple, accessible language to people on the ground there in the GCC countries to make the change. So that was the outline of the entire conference. But then we had three main themes. Number one, politics. Number two, human rights. And number three is media. Now, with the political aspects is that we should take from this conference that we want to agitate other activists and other defenders to be vocal about the situation in their countries, at the same time appreciating the sensitivities associated with that. And this is something that the human rights defenders spoke about, that they might be passionate about a certain cause or a certain activist, but that might have a serious consequences on that activist if it was highlighted or the case was highlighted. And then finally is the media aspects. Now, it's interesting to know that the media experiences in Kuwait, for example, is far different from Bahrain or Saudi, for example, because they have much more marginal freedom than Saudi and so on, and they have relatively separation of the different types of powers there in comparison to Saudi, and the idea is whether this can be capitalized on and whether such experiences can be replicated in other GCC countries. So that was just an overall summary about all what happened today. Well, not all of it, but a short summary of it, and I really hope that you all benefited from it, but also it's the beginning of something big, that we are showing a united front of GCC activists and human rights defenders who are passionate, who are absolutely agreeing on the right to speak, the right to move, the right to assemble. These are the three main elements for any civil society that sadly we don't have at the moment in the GCC countries. So that's an overall summary, and over to you, Mr. Jawad.
Thank you very much. From my side, let me say that we have dreamed, but not a theoretical dream. We have a practical dream. And I think more we dream, more we should have ambitious to let this dream to become in practice. Our dream is to live as human like the rest of the world are living it. We have to determine our destination, and we should have our rights. We are not less than any other nations who are electing their governments. We are not less than any nation that they are electing their full-power parliamentarian. We are not less than any nation that they decide the policy of the government and so on. So in this regard, we need definitely to be engaged with the elites like you, with the NGOs like you, with the other activists, journalists and politicians and academics and academic institutions and all this. We like to join international community to try to let our dream to become a little bit faster on the implementation. We have a goal and we have a mission. And this mission is not something that we cannot achieve. It is an achievable mission. What is our mission and what is our goal? Our goal to have a civil and democratic states. And we believe that stability and security in the region, not part of each individual country, in the region, as everyone knows, 35% of international energy coming from that area. We believe that that security and that stability will not be maintained through selling arms, will not be maintained to building marines or other military headquarters and so on. Just it will maintain if the international issue, if the internal issue is stable, if the an internal issue is related to the democratic process. If there is a peaceful transition of power. So these goals, we think that achievable, and more we believe in it, more we can practice it. Now, yes, we are coming from different backgrounds, sectarian-wise, religious-wise, country-wise, and so on. But this is everywhere. So if you take example in UK, you get different people or different categories of the communities, but at the end there is a policy that the government will be elected. This is the way that the GCC citizens like to see their futures. Now, we know that there are so many challenges, and as our colleague Anwar just elaborated on it, we don't want to be so dreaming in a way that's not considering the practical aspect of it. For that reason, we have a project to achieve. It is not just an event. When we thought and we get together, we said that we want to deliver the following messages to everyone, to international community, to our citizens, that first of all, we as NGO, we as human rights defenders, we as elites, we have vision. And our vision should be learned loudly. We are so much away from what we've been framed on by the governments. How we've been framed on? They say that they are a bunch of the sectarian groups, or they are a bunch of groups who are dominated by some regional power, international power, or they are so much hardliners, or they are fanatics, or they are being in force and violence. But it is totally wrong, and this is our duty to indicate this. What is our message and what is our vision? Our vision totally opposing what they want to frame us. And this is our duty. For that reason, we say that we have to continue in such events. And it is beginning, not at the end. What we end today is beginning from some other bigger project, as our colleague Anwar mentioned that. We want to continue this path to indicate that we are followers of a society which demanding a change toward political reform, toward human rights, and definitely with that one, we need an independent media resources or media bodies to do that one. And definitely all that one, if we cannot achieve it, we cannot have any sustainable development vision. I said so many times, why these visions which been adopted by the local governments? Mohammed bin Salman have vision, Isa bin Hamad in Bahrain have vision, they call it 2030 visions. But it is so fake and unpractical. Why? Because it is not based on true political reforms, it is not based on the human rights, and it is not having the achievement toward sustainable developments. We think that if we want to get to the right stability and to the right sustainable development, that it is started in the right way. Without political reform, without continuous political reforms, without basis on human rights in all this process, and without having it, definitely we will not gain neither security, neither we will get sustainable development. The secondly, we as a part of that part of the world, or as citizens or NGOs, we can work together. Regardless of our sectarian backgrounds, regardless of our whatever we are part of in that part of the world, we can work together. Why? Because we have common vision. And this is our vision, to have civil state, to govern our country, to participate on the policy, to have equal vote, to have true representative in any parliamentarian system, to elect our government, name it what you want. Maybe the proposal of constitutional monarchy, as Anwar mentioned in his presentation, is going to be something is logical to the idea, but maybe some people think it is far away, let us start something. But at least we should reach that level, if not today, definitely later on. Then let me mention that we think that whatever achievement is being done by the modern country or by the West, they gone through different struggle, and they done through different confrontation among themselves, among the neighboring country, and so on. It's not right for us to start what they started. We should start what they ended up. So no one should try to convince us that our condition is different. Try to be the way you are, and it will take you ages to reach what they're reaching in. It is not right. And a good example, the African country and Far East countries. They shifted toward further stability through democratization, through the state of law, and through the civil states. Why the GCC governments want to impose on us absolute monarchies? Why someone like Ahmed, anyone, as a citizen, shouldn't be a minister or a prime minister? Why should all the key positions within the government, for example, Bahrain, prime minister, all the consultant prime minister, or deputy of prime ministers, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Internal Affairs, even sometimes was in charge of the sport, all of them part of the ruling country. What makes him to have, what makes the ruling family to have such power on an entire? It is not just political power, it is a world power and so on. So I think what we are dreaming is not theoretical, it is practical. I want once again to thank all those who are really engaged with us to have such wonderful and successful event today. All the speakers and all our partners and all our organizers that they participate with us. But once again, if you be with us in this long run way, that's we're going to appreciate you once again, that please be with us whenever we want to organize similar events and so on. Let me mention here, today we want to hear from you in this session some suggestions or comments. Then we will note it down. Then later on, organizers will try to review the final statements. Then we will release it maybe within a few coming days. Today, we are not in a position to release a final statement, but definitely we will do that one. But rest of the time, I will leave the chairman to organize and to hear from you what suggestion you have. We'll note it down. Then later on, we'll try to get together by ourselves and our partners in this event to make a final statements within a few coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fouad and Sahar, for your insightful and important remarks emphasizing why we're here, why we set up this event, the importance of bringing together diverse voices from across the region, which is not always easy, and the importance of people, communities in the diaspora and other citizens utilising their basic rights, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, which is in stark contrast to some of the governments in the region and their approach. And of course, the importance of forward-looking action, as Anwar's presentation you said, the importance not of empty words and tangible steps we can take, and the fact that we will be publishing in the upcoming weeks a statement and a summary of this event with follow-up steps and recommendations that can be taken on an individual, institutional, different levels. So in light of that, I think I would like to hear from you, everyone who is still here, and to think of, in light of this, in terms of how we can aspire to this this future that we are looking for in this event. Are there any follow-up points building on discussions today, or anything similar to that?
Thank you for this opportunity. The Gulf region is one of the worst regions to be a woman, And women's rights in countries such as Saudi Arabia are just like appalling, and we're still discussing women driving, which should be a joke in the 21st centuries. So I think it would be interesting to have more focus on women, the role of women in civil societies, in media, and building free, open societies in the Gulf, and so to make sure that they are part of the conversation, because as we know, there can't be development or democracy without women, and making sure that they are not forgotten.
I was actually just going to make, can you hear me? I was just going to make a comment on that particular thing. If you look at the involvement, for example, of the Al-Khawaja sisters, Zainab Al-Khawaja and Mariam Al-Khawaja, the spark of revolutionary, the banner that is held by them, that, you know, their father's in prison, they have been so inspirational for other women that I think that the women are involved in the Gulf region and in Saudi Arabia and everywhere. The women are involved, but we just can't see them. So it's really the visibility of the women perhaps a little bit more, not necessarily that they're excluded or that they don't have the capacity or that they're not already engaged. It's only that they're not visible. And that, I think, comes more from a cultural point of view than anything else, because I personally don't believe that women are excluded from the political discourse or the human rights discourse whatsoever. For me, I could be considered a feminist. I think that in essence, women's rights are human rights, and so I will try to build a capacity for everybody, but I think that women in the Gulf region and that geopolitical area, they actually are already engaged in it, maybe just making them more visible, but not necessarily pushing them out there in front, because culturally, I don't think that it's going to, it's something that would be aspirational, but not necessarily realistic.
Thank you very much, Tara. Yeah, I think I would echo those sentiments. Dave, are you...
Can I speak also?
Oh, yeah. In light of Tara's point, actually, yeah.
It's just, I went to this seminar like earlier this week where Madhawiyah Rashid spoke, and this other woman who was called Lynn something, and she's like an academic who's working with this artist, this Saudi artist called Miss Safa, who does these like cool murals, and she has these t-shirts to say, I am my own guardian. And someone raised a really good point that blew my mind that I'd like to share. It's not that it blew my mind, it's that I think it's really like sidelined. It's the fact that when we talk about women's rights in the Gulf or in the like Middle East more broadly, we always talk about like emancipatory discourses. So we always talk about agency. We always focus on these middle-class women who are, I don't know, looking to drive and whatever. And what we don't focus on is other sort of feminist discourses, like women who I don't know, are poorer and they want the money. This was the example that was given. They want the money to buy a car so that they can drive. And I just think it's interesting to keep in mind that there are other ways of being feminist and other ways of sort of fighting for your rights that don't necessarily fit in with this discourse. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very important point, particularly for people sometimes in the West who might use some of these issues but without kind of cultural sensitivity or the right kind of linking with other issues like class. So I'll send to Jury and Creative Me.
Thanks, everyone. We have very few women in the room. I thought that was a bit of a challenge from the get-go. But my takeaway, my kind of main takeaway from today, and the thing which I think I've learned from what you've all said and those also who have left, is that, okay, well, so we started with politics, and from Marc and others, that it's difficult. It's a difficult environment in which to work. And then we talked about human rights. And okay, we all know it's a difficult environment in which to work. And then finally, Bill in Haifa, again, difficult place to work. But it's not monolithic. And I think
Jawad's comments at the end exemplify that it's not a monolithic, it's not as if there's no ways in. But my takeaway, in a way, getting from the session that I was involved in, getting away from that kind of monolith of bilateral or multilateral interventions versus or in conjunction with the UN, in the face of it not being a monolith, is that I think we need to build networks. And these kind of things, little bits of networks with the NGOs, with think tanks with bits of media. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be straightforward, but I just think what we're trying to do is trying to say, my wasta is bigger than your wasta. And I think there's kind of a way in for that in these discourses. I don't know where or how, on what basis, but there does seem to be some glimmer of hope.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely agree with you. Like, I am all honesty as much as I'm one of those feminists, and I do truly believe that women should play a vital role in everything, politics, human rights, and media. But you and I both know well how the Western media like to focus on certain cases and not others. And the stories that we hear about is either women who are running away from their families or women who left their religion, and they have every right to do so. I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but the West, they have this Orientalist lenses to which they look through these cases from. And it feeds into the Islamophobia industry where the women are oppressed and the white men are going to save them. You know, the white nations are going to save those women. And we've seen that in the case of, for example, Rahat al-Qunun. She's absolutely have every right to be protected from her family and ensure that she's not facing any domestic violence. But we have seen how some Canadian human rights capitalized on her case to further division, but also demonization of Muslims and so on. There are some, what you call it, conservative Muslim Saudi women who have sacrificed a lot. They just don't have the links with those celebrities as much as Lujain al-Haddad and others. So while we see these cases there in the media and we should support Lujain al-Haddad and others, we also have to know that there are people like Nof Abdelaziz, who we don't know much about her, but she sacrifices a lot and she's still in prison. So yeah, I agree with you, like, that we should be appreciating how the West likes to focus on certain cases and not others.
Back to the core of the issue is that we want really support to promote our vision toward, as Anwar once again mentioned, that win-win. Our vision is related to the one cases, and there won't be any losers. We are not coming here to build, say, coming empire to demolish some others' empire. We are coming here to build up a vision that it is joint in empire. Our vision is that anyone is gaining from the region can gain more if they supported this vision. Believe me, whoever think that they want the area just for the energy, our vision is supporting that. Why? Because we want to be part of the international community. Whoever is thinking that we should be away from sectarian, we are within, and we are planning, and our vision is supporting that, to be away from sectarian. Whoever is thinking that we should have a long-run strategy to have a better infrastructure for the country and for the welfare of the individual, of the citizens. This is our vision that we are talking about. Anyone is believing in sustainable stability and continuation of that one, our vision is talking about that one. Anyone is believing on the human rights our vision is talking about, then what is the differences? Why they should be a little bit afraid of those quote-unquote human defenders or opposition or hardline journalists and so on? Believe me, we're gonna be a better alternative from the current regime. Doesn't mean that this is entire to be rolled out, but we should read it in different versions. And whoever is saying that, yes, there's a reform in the country, they are lying at everyone, because how can I believe there is any type of the reform if almost all the oppositions are either they are behind the bar or even they are totally banned from any elections, away from partnership to be part of the government. You know, for example, Bahrain, Sheikh Ali Salman is behind the bar. The rest of the opposition figures, the opposition leaders, all of them, either they are in exile or behind the bar. At the same time, many their nationality has been revoked. And almost all opposition societies, they are banned. Even if you are being member of these opposition parties 10 years back, a decade, then resign, you will be banned from any incoming elections. Then someone will tell me that Bahrain is going in the right direction and there is slow motion of the reform. So we say that this is a fake reform. It is a very, very damaging the name of the reform. Please help us to let our message to be more realistically to be delivered to the international community. And once again, we can gain it, not lose it. We can have win-win equation. Now there is win and lose, but our vision is toward one another.
Thank you again, Jawad and Sahar. And yeah, I think some themes that emerge from this discussion are the sort of intersectionality of some of these issues, feminism, class, and the importance of networking, as Jury said, and the really importance of meetings like this, not just to discuss these issues, but to really practice them. So I think, unless, are there any more burning questions?
Yeah, what I really are hearing presenting to us is that the regimes seem to...
I think my voice is loud enough. It really is apparent that the regime's method of maintaining stability is to freeze everything and to try to keep it isolated and contained, whereas the vision that you have that is shared amongst all of us, I believe, is one for progress, where everybody can participate in productive, positive change in a way that everyone will benefit from it. And there's an urgency to doing that so that things don't continue to descend into the potential chaos that we're seeing on the horizon. And really, I have thoroughly enjoyed the summary of the day, but I do think that my takeaway from it is that there is this overwhelming desire to push towards a collective progress together, and that's what I'm seeing.
Thank you for this event. I inspired because all the opposition from the GCC countries, they are here. And really, I'm really glad that all of us in here. From this event, that I think if you made a small committee that they gather together from all these organizations, sat together and have a strategy to have this strategy about when to win. Yeah, if you don't have a plan for a future, it is not enough to sit for this event and that's it. We have to have a plan for farsighted, for a long, at least 5 years, 10 years, not only for this event. This event is glad. It's really fantastic. Oh, we are all gathered We listen to all of you, but what is the next step? We need next step, not only the system. Thank you.
Very important point. I think we probably won't finalise it tonight, but hopefully this will be at the forefront in the upcoming weeks. And so, any more questions?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to reflect on is the conversation we sort of had about cybersecurity laws. And I think we need to be careful not to drift towards more of a simplistic approach of completely disbanding the value of cybersecurity laws in the region and sort of globally. I think there's certainly a value for cybersecurity laws in terms of maintaining national security, in terms of maintaining communal cohesion, while the laws that seem to be being drafted in the region are definitely encroaching on individual rights. One proposal I think that should be made, or an alternative model that should be made that still hasn't been figured out in liberal democracies alike, is what are exactly the mechanisms that would ideally exist within these laws that would maintain individual rights and also serve their purpose, preserving national security and communal cohesion. And so one thing I would propose is drafting this alternative model that I don't think there's a proper benchmark for elsewhere.
Last word. Thank you. Thank you. No, actually, this lady, she said what I want to say. Zainab, really, I once said like this: we don't have to stop on only this conference. We have to continue it. We have to put plan. We have to send our message to all the world. We won't live as a human. Actually, in the GCC country, all the people in GCC country, we cannot live as a human. We don't have right. We don't have right to say what we want to say. We want to have a right, even if I want to go to Bahrain, I cannot go to Bahrain. Bahrain, Emirat, we cannot travel between our countries because we are only activists in GCC country. I'm very happy about this conference. I hope the next conference we have to see what we are to achieve it for the next year. I hope that. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. And on that very apt last point, and spoken very good English, I must say.